So it's very exciting to be having a webinar that's part of our Pride calendar for the month of October here in East London. So Pride is traditionally the South African Pride. October is the South African Pride month, and we are celebrating the first ever Pride March that took place on the 13th of October. And that particular Pride March, more than 30 years ago now, was not only about the whole full spectrum of diversity, including race. Let me actually just put my video on. There we go. I'm quite a visual speaker, gesturing speaker. And so it's very exciting that we now really this month, there's always been little things happening in East London during Pride Month, but we really want to pull it all together. And there's extraordinary individuals, NGOs, companies, businesses that are all wanting to build an inclusive and diverse community. And we are trying to bring all of that into one program. So tonight's seminar is being presented through the GSA, the Gender and Sexuality Alliance of Buffalo City. We're a non-financial organization, meaning there's no money that changes hands. We literally have a WhatsApp group and a Facebook page. So look out for us on Facebook. And all we're doing is we are a community-based organization trying to liaise different people and organizations supporting communities here in East London. And what I want to do tonight is it's going to be a little bit of a scientific lecture. I've got a very much a medical bent that I'm bringing to it. But I do find that our sex education curriculum is currently a little bit sparse in terms of really helping us understand the full landscape of what we understand about sexual and gender diversity at the moment. I think the schools are slowly catching up, but certainly the sex education I had in Pretoria, of all places, 30 years ago, or should I say the non-existent sex education that I've had. And I think a lot of us as adults sometimes feel a little bit out of our depth also when our teenagers or adolescents sometimes seems more up to date than we are. So I'm going to start off with just a little bit about who I am. So I work in East London. I work at Makiwane Hospital in Tansane, where I'm a family physician. So I see patients every day and the outpatients there. And I'm employed as a senior lecturer with Walter Sisulu University. So I've got medical students and registrars. And this talk I actually did to my own interns and department this week, Monday, and did it at Butterworth Hospital last week. So it's sort of part of our general educating efforts. My huge interest in terms of working with adolescent care actually came partly through my involvement with HIV. So I'm the coordinator for the HIV Clinician Society here in East London, but I've been the convener for the Diploma of HIV Management for the last 3 years. So doctors who do their diplomas in HIV, I'm the person who sets those exams. And I sit on the executive committee of a couple of organizations, including the Southern African Sexual Health Association, as well as the Professional Association of Transgender Healthcare. And so, as I've said, I do have a very much a medical scientific bent, and us trying to understand better the diversity of sex and gender. So we often talk about the Rainbow Nation, very appropriate for Pride Month. And I really want to just bring into the room the fact that each of us will have our own cultural, religious, and personal perspectives on sex, sexual orientation, and gender diversity. And I think what we sometimes forget is that all of the ideas we have about sex is to do with what your own culture is, or your own religion is, or the way you have sex. So quite often we have a particular perspective that we've built up, and it's very much linked to our own experiences. But of course, we are not all the same. And in the South African setting, we are trying to live up to this Ubuntu principle of having a community where we all have equal rights. And I think that's helpful to understand that what we are trying to do is not to try and change or shift somebody else's moral ideas or sexual ideas or whatever your particular landscape is around sexuality. But I do believe, and I've seen this, that it's very possible to be able to stand very strongly in whatever your own perspectives are and still be able to be accepting and affirming of one another. And being able to understand how other people think and work helps us with that affirmation process. So all we're doing tonight is just helping to give you information. And I love this. This is a study that was done in 2016 by the Human Research Council in South Africa. Very useful to go and download if any of you are interested in some data. It's called Progressive Prudes. And I just want to highlight this little block here, where in that study, 51% of South Africans believe that gay people should have the same rights as all other cultures. So that was the question on the survey. And in that same sample, 72% of people felt that same-sex sexual activity is morally wrong. And what I love about this, because I do love this, is the fact that we can do this in South Africa. And I think the rest of the world struggles a bit with this. We have this amazing ability to have our own very strong ideas, our own very strong cultural ideas, and still be able to live in a community where we are protecting the rights of other people. And I think what we're seeing in the world, and almost seems to be going backwards, is that there's a tendency where people will have their own personal ideas about sex or gender, and then will actually bring it right into the law system and try and apply it to others who are not like them. So we're going to talk through the whole diversity today, and by the end of this, you will understand all of these terms and more. So when I do a lot of sessions in schools as well on something I call sexual intelligence. And that's pretty much when we do sex education within school settings. This is sort of the ultimate game, is how do we create adolescents that are sexually intelligent? And if I work with patients or you work with clients, how do you help foster sexual intelligence within relationships? And it's very much built on the same model as emotional intelligence. So it has these four key aspects. So the first one is being able to understand and reflect on your own sexual self. Who am I as a, how's the way that I put together? And then being able to manage that. And that usually means, how can I communicate that to somebody else? And then if you're in any kind of relationship, being able to understand that other person's whole sexual landscape, and then being able to manage that relationship between the two of you. So these are the four components that we need to be able to have relationships that are not disastrous. So something I use, and I love using this with the teenagers, and this is called the gender jabu. It's my little extended version. It's based on something called the genderbread person. I also know there's all kinds of wonderful things being done around universes and constellations. This is a very little practical tool that I use to go through with teenagers to help them start understanding their own sexual self. And that's basically mostly what we're going to be doing in the next half an hour, is just get a bit of an understanding of how we work. We're going to look at three components. We're going to look at who we are, so that's identity. We're going to look at orientation, so who we love. And we're going to look very much at sexuality, how intimacy works for us. So I'm going to bring in some terminology, and there's a whole language these days in terms of diversity. We've had the same things around in the old days when in terms of women, and then in terms of race, even in terms of religion, there are terminologies in terms of how we talk about things. So when I talk about biological sex, I mean, this is what the midwife says when you are born. So the midwife goes, oh, it's a boy, or oh, it's a girl, or it might even be that there's a mixture of different sexual organs and the midwife might not be sure, and that we call intersex. So typically it's your biological stuff. It's your DNA, or your XX or XY chromosome. Do you have ovaries or testicles? Do you have a womb or a prostate? Do your body predominantly makes testosterone or estrogen? Do you make breasts, or do you make body hair? So these are the typical sort of characteristics of biological sex. And I just want to point out one small thing. So intersex was treated, and we are very much advocating to change this as a disorder. It used to be called disorder, and we are now using the word differentiation for that. And the focus of that is to really be able to look at advocating for letting people themselves decide what they want to do with their bodies when right. So what's happened before is that the child will be born, the genital organs can go either way, and their parents and the doctors decide what they're going to do. And they might even have surgical intervention. And sometimes they even have children where they decide it's going to be easier to turn this child into a girl. So we do the surgery and we give the child female hormones at the right age. And then you have a child that grows up and actually goes, but this is not my gender. And so there's a lot of advocacy now around protecting children with intersex, and also start treating it as just differentiation, part of variety, and the child themselves, when they grow up, can decide what they want to do. So this brings us to this next term, gender identity. And this is relatively, although it's always been with us as a human race, it's a relatively new term. And with gender, I'm using the Yogyakarta Principles, which is the international human rights law, defines gender identity as each person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond with the sex assigned at birth. So that's the biological sex. So what's interesting about identity and personality and all of that is that it works, it's very much part of the later evolutionary part of the human's brain. So our biological part, our bodies have our, obviously, whatever it is, testes, ovaries, etc. But the way we think about ourselves actually lies within our prefrontal cortex. And that prefrontal cortex sits on the front here, is also the part of ourselves where we will identify, for example, in terms of things like personality. So we might get to a point where we go, I'm actually an introverted person, or I'm an extroverted person. And the similar way, we can start reflecting on identity, how we think and feel about ourselves. And this may not be the same as our biological sex. So what we know when we talk about transgender, and I'm going to spend a bit of time on that as one of the gender identities, is that there's very much a biological basis for the way that these identities get laid down. So if you look everywhere in the world and you're able to get some sort of data, it's difficult to get data in a world where it's illegal, for example, but we would say between 0.5 to 0.7%, maybe even up to 1.5% of people's identity in their prefrontal cortex is different than in their bodies. So if you look at human development, in the first 3 months of pregnancy, your biological sex, your testes and ovaries start to develop. But the prefrontal cortex starts to develop in the second trimester of pregnancy, the second 3 months. And that's both genetics. So there's about a 39.1% influence of genetics that we've seen through studies. And then, of course, like with all things, there's hormones and all kinds of other factors they're still trying to tease. But what we do know is that that neural network is laid down by the time you are born. And these different forms of identity and orientation are very much understood as variations of human diversity. And of course, as we grow older, we discover and understand what our own personalities and identity are. So because the science has moved on and we now understand a lot more about how identity works, we've actually had to do some hard work as the medical profession. And in 2019, the WHO Assembly actually, in their assembly, the World Health Organization made an announcement that being trans or gender diverse does not mean to suffer a mental disorder. And that we've taken out terms like gender identity disorder out of the psychiatric textbooks, out of the classification for disease, you know, that code you put in your medical aid forms. And there's much more of an understanding of respecting diversity rather than pathologizing it. I have had, and this is probably the most common question I ask when I teach about gender identity, is why is it so much more common now? You know, 20 years ago, there was very few children who would come out as being transgender. And I think a helpful history is looking at the story of left-handedness. So in 1939, it was unacceptable to be left-handed. You used to get whacked on the hand if you used your left hand. And the prevalence at that stage was recorded as 2.1%. But over the next 30 to 50 years, neurologists became quite clear that actually it's quite harmful if a child's wired to be left-handed to now try and force him to be right-handed. And so schooling and education and occupational therapy shifted to allow left-handers to be left-handed. And then by 1972, when they were looking, they noticed that the prevalence is actually somewhere between 12 and 14% of the population is left-handed. So we'll see the same thing with transgender. There's probably a set percentage of the population that is transgender. We think somewhere under 2%. And as it becomes more acceptable and the term is out there that people can go, oh, that's what I'm experiencing, we will see more and more people being able to name what it is that they identify. So here's let's get down to some terms. So apologies for those that are very familiar with these. So cisgender basically means if your gender identity and your sex assigned at birth are aligned. So the word where I've said, you're a girl, and you grow up and you identify also as a girl. And I think what's interesting with cisgender people is quite often we don't ever have to think about it. Am I a girl, and why am I a girl? And I can feel I'm a girl, or have a realization you're a girl, because the whole world around you tells you all the time that you're a girl because of your biological sex. But this is quite different for transgender people who have a gender identity that is different than the sex assigned at birth. And as the prefrontal cortex develops, and there's these sort of particular, some people quite early, by 3, 4, might start feeling that something's not right. The prefrontal cortex comes online at about 8, 9 years old. So then you'll have some people going, no, the way I think and feel about myself is different than my body. And for some people, it's only when the sex hormones start kicking in that they have this incongruence between their identity and their biological sex. And this is something that, for example, you won't find cisgendered adult people suddenly shifting. If people come out when they're adults, it's usually because they've already had that experience when they were younger, but they did not have a name for it. And then there's actually quite a lot of in between. So we call this gender diverse. And these are just people who do not conform to society's or culture's expectations of men and women. And I think identity is such an interesting thing, because a lot of identity and the language which we use to describe identity is so deeply rooted in culture and what we define as masculine and feminine and how you define that. And so out of that, it's become more and more about people being able to give words for what their inner experience is, which may be different from culture. So now we're going to quickly just run through the terminology so that we can become comfortable. What does it mean when somebody says they're a transgender woman? So a transgender woman, or can be trans woman or trans femme, is somebody who was assigned male at birth. So that's the terminology that we would use, but they identify as a woman. There is also now in discussion, should we use the word identify? But this is the identity that they experience from a higher level, and the pronouns that they use is she and her. And I've got two lovely trans women here. That's Laverne Cox from Orange is the New Black, a very active American actress in trans rights. And then in 2021, Lechlo Gonolo Machaba became our first trans woman to actually make Miss SA Top 30. Then on the right here, we've got transgender man or trans mask. And this is somebody who was assigned female at birth, but identifies as a man, and we would use the pronouns he, him for him. And some of you might know Elliot Page, those of you that's watched Umbrella Academy. And it was interesting with Elliot is that he was, in the first season, he was still at that stage playing a female character. And then he went through transition between the 2 seasons. And then in the second season, they actually transitioned him to a male character. Noxie Melame is a South African trans man who's actually got a YouTube channel where he's been talking about his transition and experiences, and also a great advocate. And then the third group is a term where people will identify as a non-binary, gender fluid, gender queer, agender. Don't try and figure out what each of those mean. Ask people what they mean by that. And this could be any biological sex. And they don't necessarily consider themselves either male or female. They could be neither, they could be both, they could be something different on every day. And the pronouns there is the singular they, them. Very commonly used. Shakespeare used a lot of the singular they, them, and we still use it in normal language today when we refer to someone or somebody or a child. So if there's someone at the door, go and open for them, we are using the singular they, them. And Zanele Moholi is a South African non-binary artist, a photographer, an extraordinary photographer. They're at the Mocha Museum in Cape Town, and they've had an exhibition at the Tate, and they do extraordinary photographic portraits around gender diversity. So you have your biological sex, you have gender identity, and then gender expression is something completely different. So gender expression is just simply how you want to dress up, and that may have no relationship to your underlying gender identity. So here is Jonathan Von Ness receiving their Emmy. He's actually non-binary, and there you can see they've got the lovely beard and the extraordinarily gorgeous shoes and dress, and that's a nice way to show like a mixture of different genders expressed in the same outfit. So quite often when you might look at somebody, you're not going to be able to assume what gender identity they have, and a polite way to ask is just ask what the pronouns they would like to use, and then to use those. Excellent. Bit of a mouthful, gender identity, because it feels relatively new. Sexual orientation is more familiar. We're more used to talking about who we are attracted to, and just a reminder that sexual orientation and gender identity are two completely different things. So if you look back in history, it's interesting to note that until 1992, homosexuality was still a medical diagnosis. We've also had to take that out of all our textbooks. And up until 1994 in South Africa, it was still a crime. It was still in our legal system. And then, of course, we had this extraordinary constitution. And South Africa is one of the very few constitutions which actually prohibits unfair discrimination on the grounds specifically of sexual orientation. And gender is also mentioned there, and that includes gender identity that's been tried in court. There's actually not that many countries that's got that level of protection. And what we are seeing, for example, in Italy recently and in America, depending on who's in government, some of those rights can be taken away. Where in South Africa, the constitution is our highest rates. And then, of course, very worrying is that there's still at least 20 countries in the world, and I had to add Uganda to this now, where there's still death sentences for certain LGBT behaviors. So it's not all parts of the world where these rights are protected. So yes, let's get a little bit to the terminology. So the ones that's very familiar as being heterosexual, so attracted to the opposite gender, homosexual, being attracted to the same gender, so that's sort of the pride flag and the lesbian flag there. Bisexual, sexually attracted to both the male and the female gender. And pansexual is a sexual attraction to all people, regardless of gender. And again, it's helpful to, when you're in a relationship with somebody, you'll have to find out how they define, because pansexual and bisexual, people just use terms depending on what they feel fits for them. But it's also important that we start getting a little bit away from just thinking about sexual attraction in terms of sexual attraction. And I'm going to talk a lot more about that when we talk about how we play. And so we're also looking at some relationships might not have much sexual attraction in it, but it's predominantly romantic in attraction. And so you also get homoromantic, biromantic, and panromantic. There's also polyamory. So remember when I said in the first slide, we all have that ability to have our own ideas. This is one of those ones where I find people get a little bit wide-eyed sometimes. But polyamory is a form of ethical, consensual non-monogamy. So this is not somebody who's having an affair, where everybody involved in that relationship are consensual but it's more than one partner at a time. And you can get hierarchical. So you might have somebody who's in a relationship, a couple, and then they might have secondary partners. Or you might have, instead of a couple, there's something like a triad, so 3 people living together or 4 people living together. And there's lots of different other terms, which I haven't covered here. It's interesting to think in terms of how does that fit with polygamy, and sometimes people with polyamory find things they sort of class apart. Polygamy is very much usually a cultural or religious practice where somebody has multiple spouses, but of course a polygamous relationship where everybody's consensual and is happy and comfortable within that relationship certainly also counts as a polyamory relationship. Great, I've done that quite quickly because I'd love to spend a bit of time on sexuality. And this is where it gets a little bit more interesting. And I think this is one of the areas where we're very much behind within education. So one of the frustrations is when we look at the world today, and it's partly medical profession's fault in terms of what's still in our textbooks, is that when we talk about intimacy, we always talk about sex. But actually, there are different ways to be bodily attracted to somebody and different ways of being bodily intimate. So I'm talking about bodily connection with somebody else. And I'm using the word sensual pleasure versus sexual pleasure. And they are completely different because they're mediated by completely different hormones. And it's not the default that everybody's intimacy preference is sexual pleasure. And I'm going to explain a little bit what I mean by that. So what's happened historically is that when we first started studying sex, all we did was sex. And the big study that got everybody excited was a study done by Masters and Johnson. This is in the 1960s in America and Virginia. And they literally got couples to have sex in like a room with I assume a one-way mirror and various things attached to them, and they sort of try to plot what they call the sexual response cycle. Any of you in the medical field would have seen this, the cycle on the right here. And what's interesting to note is that when they did the study, they invited in, you had to be heterosexual, you had to be married, you had to be cisgendered, and the woman had to be able to have orgasm during vaginal sex, which is, I think, less than 5 or 10% of the female population. So they basically selected out a very specific population within a very specific time period. And out of that, we've defined all intimacy gets measured against that. And probably one of the biggest fallacies that came out of this study is this idea of libido. So the idea was that you feel sexual desire when you are attracted to somebody, and then there's arousal when you get under the covers, etc., etc. And so there was this idea that people are supposed to have a libido. They're supposed to have this spontaneous sexual attraction. And so there was this whole thing about trying to figure out, well, what now is a normal libido? How much, how often are you supposed to have feelings of sexual attraction? And I'm going to talk a bit more about this in a minute. And this is a challenge because these are some of the sexual myths that's been built up. And we've still got diagnoses in the psychiatric textbooks for people who don't experience sexual attraction. And actually that is definitely also part of diversity. So to be able to understand physical attraction, you have to understand hormones. So we're going to do a little bit of hormone stuff because endocrinology is what gives you the experience. And there's two main hormones involved in intimacy. There's quite a lot of other ones, but there's two ones that you can almost see as a kind of polarity. The one is testosterone. That's the one we know, and I'm going to go through that quite quickly. And the other one is oxytocin, which we sort of know of, but we tend to see it as like a precursor or an extra or a little something on the side, where actually these are two completely different ways of experiencing intimacy. In terms of diversity, some people are very strongly just testosterone mediated. Some people are very strongly only oxytocin mediated, and there's a lot of mixture in between. So a lot of sex, for example, will involve both of these hormones, and it's helpful to understand where one sits within this spectrum. So firstly, let's just go through testosterone mediated. So this is often visual stimuli that would create an attraction to somebody, for example, not necessarily, but you see it's very strongly linked to our visual system. And the experience that one has physically is that of what we call sexual desire or lust. And that usually have very particular physiological changes. So typically erections, for example, in a teenage boy. During arousal, what is experienced is actually an increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, increased muscular tension. And what is happening is testosterone is the hormone that the body is using to procreate. So it has a big focus towards orgasm and towards the play zones. So the idea is that the erogenous zones get activated and there's a big push to get towards orgasm. And it's a very linear cycle, as you've seen on the previous page. And what's interesting with the hormones is they do have a bit of an emotional content as well. And testosterone is very much linked to feelings of success, feelings of power, and potentially also to feelings of aggression, a little bit the dark side of testosterone. Great. So this one we know. This is what you see in the movies. This is what's in the medical textbooks. So what does oxytocin-mediated attraction looks like? So quite often, this is much more to do with bonding or connecting with someone. And even if it's from a distance, it has to do with seeing somebody that you feel that you have a connection to. And the typical experience of this arousal is the sensual attraction, and it's a physical experience. And we often call it an infatuation. We call it a crush. I'm a little bit nervous about the word romantic, because sometimes romantic just means an emotional attachment. And I'm talking here about the very strong physical changes that you feel when you're attracted to somebody in this way. So sensual arousal, so say you got together with another person who's sensually attracted back to you, and it might end up in a kiss or holding hands or chatting all night. Sensual arousal is got actually a decrease in blood pressure, a decrease in muscular tension, and there's a feeling of relaxation and expansion. And the physical intimacy is very erogenous zones for testosterone. As a matter of fact, the erogenous zones don't wake up at all, because this has got nothing to do with orgasm. So what is much more important is touch and connection and bonding with somebody else. So the arousal is not linear at all. It tends to be expansive and build on each other and experience focus and very much in the minute. And we know the oxytocin hormone is often called the love hormone, and it's the hormone that has to do with connection and bonding and affection. So it's also the hormone when we excrete, when we breastfeed, for example, and it helps people to bond with their babies. So this is just to give us a bit of an experience of the emotional content of these two hormones. And this, of course, is testosterone. We've had a few moments like that with the World Cup recently. And this experience is this experience of getting the goal of of power. So what does oxytocin look like? I hope there was an ah moment there out there. So oxytocin is what gets literally released when we see small, vulnerable things, or when we're in a situation when we're nurturing or bonding anybody else. So both these hormones have got very powerful physical experiences, but they're actually very, very different. So to make it even more interesting is that there's been some amazing, actually, women scientists who's been taking apart that Kaplan, Virginia, the Masters in Kaplan cycle, and is starting to look at trying to understand desire in a different way. And I think Emily Nagoski has really revolutionized with this term that she brought in, talking about responsive desire versus spontaneous desire. And I'm just going to explain what I mean by these two things. So both of these have got to do with testosterone-based desire, so sexual desire for an intimate partner. But with spontaneous desire, I mean, this is somebody who has spontaneous sexual desire, probably regularly in a week, with minimal or no triggers. So it takes very little for the desire to come, maybe like a lovely picture in a magazine or somebody walking past, or even very little triggers. And if you want to think in terms of spontaneous desire, a good example is your teenage boy, who's still very much, about 95% of teenage boys very strongly experience a spontaneous desire. So they also have spontaneous sexual fantasies, so fantasies that comes up even unasked for. And there's a drawn with, if you have a spontaneous desire, you'll be very much drawn more to pornography or sexually explicit material, and you enjoy that kind of media. And of course, a spontaneous desire, one would expect to see masturbation and that to be quite common. What we now understand is that there's also people who have something called responsive desire. And responsive desire means that the sexual desire is responsive and always context specific. So usually within a relationship where somebody is feeling loved and safe, for example, usually already a lot of oxytocin on board, and then usually in a scenario where they're not, where they feel safe and where they feel they have the energy and the circumstances needed for sexual desire to actually arise. But it does mean that they do not normally experience any spontaneous sexual desire. So if there's not a context for it, they do not experience it. They have little or no sexual fantasies. And if they do fantasize, it's romantic fantasies. It's a bit like those romance movies. It just goes up to the kiss and then they sink below the horizon. The kind of media that will they enjoy would be much more romantic novels or romantic movies. And actually, they would rarely or never need to masturbate because there's none of this spontaneous sexual desire. Now, one of our challenges is that a lot of people with responsive desire has been told over the years that there is something wrong with them, and that there's been a lot of, and if you look at pharmaceutical companies, has been desperately trying to find some drug to induce sexual desire. But actually, it just has to do with being able to understand how your intimacy works. This does not mean that they don't experience desire. It's only that it experiences in specific scenarios. So let's get a little bit to some of the terminologies. So this is the term asexual is also much more common these days. That's the flag up there. And the definition of that is a person who does not experience sexual attraction to another person. And now that we understand how testosterone, these will be testosterone, they do not have that testosterone pathway. And there is a lot of different, this is sort of an umbrella term, and there's lots of different variations under this. So for example, you get some asexuals that are sex negative, where they actually find the idea of sex unpalatable, sex repulsed, leave the room if there's any sexual scenes on TV. Some people are asexual or sex neutral. Take it or leave it. My body doesn't respond like that, but I don't particularly mind it. But you also get asexuals that are sex positive. They see sex as a normal, healthy part of life. They themselves don't experience sexual desire, but they are pretty au fait even with having sex. And there's some related identities that also fall under this umbrella. Gray sexual. So this is somebody who never or hardly ever experiences sexual interest, but it might happen on rare occasions. And then there's demisexual, which is somebody who only feels sexual attraction once they have a strong emotional connection to somebody. So remember when I spoke about that responsive desire? This would actually, and I've been working with responsive desire patients for many, many years. And then only this year discovered the term demisexual and realized, well, hold on, this is actually a description of a very specific experience that we see in a lot of women. And one of the things we are doing is re-looking at the research through the years. So there was a study done in the last 5 or 10 years where they were looking at American women, I think it was over the ages of 30, who were in married, stable relationships, and they were measuring libido because that's what we do. And they found that 70% of women in those relationships, older women in stable relationships, had no libido. So they had no spontaneous sexual fantasies and no spontaneous desire. And then this was now classified as hypoactive sexual disorder. But now we can look back at that and go, hold on, maybe quite a big percentage of them is actually demisexual and would experience sexual desire in the correct context. So this is one of those works in progress, and that's the flag for the demisexuals. And it's important to understand that 74% of asexual people may still experience romantic attraction. So this is just talking about the testosterone cycle. So you do also get something that's aromantic, and you get some people who are ace arrows, so they're both asexual and aromantic. And somebody who's aromantic does not have any romantic attractions to others. So they don't do the mushy oxytocin bonding kind of thing. It's not the way their body works, and they may or may not have sexual attraction. And again, there's gray romantic, so people who might rarely get romance. And then there's demi-romantic. So somebody has to be really emotionally connected to somebody, really, really good friends with somebody, and then maybe romantic feelings will arise. And I did mention earlier that testosterone and oxytocin is not the only hormones. So we also have a scenario where one can use hormones like adrenaline that can slightly spice sex up. And very important, this is what we would call the release of safe adrenaline. And what I mean by that is the difference between going down Butterworth Pass, it's a hair-raising pass just outside East London, without your brakes, terrifying, and going down a roller coaster. So going down a roller coaster can be quite fun for some people, not everybody. But if you were going down Butterworth without brakes, that'll be horrifying for everybody. And most sexual play, which brings a little bit of adventure or a little bit of spicing it up, always happens in being able to create safety. So for example, sexual fantasy, one can have sexual fantasies that might be terrifying if it happened in real life, but because you're controlling it in your own mind and you are completely able to decide what and how it's going to happen, that actually creates safety, bit of excitement, but safety to be able to enjoy the fun. Sexual role play and cosplay fall into that. And then I just want to say a word about BDSM. So your bondage, discipline, dominance, submission, all of that kind of stuff always makes the eyebrows raise. What's interesting with BDSM, in the world of sexual health, we think that BDSM is one of the most mature adult types of sex play out there because of the extraordinary level of informed consent. So for somebody to regularly go be in BDSM or be in BDSM scenarios before they engage, otherwise it's not fun, it has to be safe. So a bit like the roller coaster, before they sit down, they will have a full conversation about exactly what they are expecting, exactly what they like, what they don't like, how far things can go, what their thresholds are. And there's rules. Anytime you can pull out during whatever is happening, if you're not comfortable, they will have a safe word system. And if we add more of this level of informed consent into normal sort of vanilla style, missionary style sex, sex will probably be much, much, much safer. And then there's also kink. And then the only one that's probably dangerous is erotic asphyxiation, which is where you actually reduce the oxygen flow while you're orgasming. And apart from that one, which can be dangerous if you're not sure what you're doing, everything else is extremely safe. And as a matter of fact, sex is one of the few human things that we have that's actually good for your health. And actually very safe. And it's one of those things that can give us a little bit of pleasure without having to feel guilty about it. So just to complete all of our attraction things, there are also aesthetic attractions. So that's just, person you take out on a date to your as your plus one, where it's purely about physical appearances. And then emotional attraction, which all of us experience in our friendships, in our relationships. And that has to do with building an emotional bond with someone. So if somebody is ace arrow, so asexual and aromantic, they might still want to build a very close relationship to somebody on an aesthetic basis or on an emotional basis. And these are often called queer platonic relationships. So they're not romantic in nature. There's no sexual sex involved. There's no hugging or kissing or cuddling involved, but it's got a very close emotional connection, more so than just an ordinary friendship. Great. So there we go. We've just covered a whole lot of diversity. And what I'd like to do now is I'm just going to bring it right into the relationship and look at how does